Hello, my name is Mike Harrington. I run Edaphos. It's an agronomy company based in Oxfordshire with a particular interest in soil health, soil fertility and regeneration. The talk today really is about a systems approach to farming, the way that some direct drilling systems are not working particularly well, how we decide how to move towards a regenerative system and utilise direct drilling, cover crop, bringing it all towards in a package which includes the environmental schemes and looking at the system in a holistic approach. From the Edaphos side of things and agronomy, it's sometimes difficult to do talk simply because what we're trying to discuss is holistic practices. And if we talk about one part of a complete system, you start to lose the impetus of the whole system. So just purely direct drilling or cover crops, things like that. And the dilemmas really that we're having in some of the direct drill systems and regenerative systems, as they're called. We've got a lot of farms, I think, which are going backwards. So what I'm going to try and do in the next sort of hour really is just talk about some of the good things, the bad things, a little bit about cover crops, direct drilling, a little bit about everything really, because it is an integrated system. And our problem in agriculture simply has been that we've disassociated ourselves from the whole, from nature. And so, as you'll see as we go through talks really, is that as we disassociate ourselves, we have to buy more things to replenish the things that we're not getting from nature. We're bypassing issues and using chemicals, and while that has worked for a while, we're getting increasing problems all the time. So the first start really, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the beginning in the 40s and 50s and the issues that we had. And this was looking at soil from a biological perspective. A lot of interesting work done in the 40s and 50s before nitrogen suddenly flooded onto the scene. But this was a rather complicated a discussion about what soil biology was. I added a few words to it because I think it was a little bit different. But functioning correctly, soil is a living entity, a constantly interacting, interdependent whole, operating a continuous cycle of expansion and contraction, digestion and mineralization. And it's quite a mouthful, that really. But from a biological point of view, this is an example here of a really good soil. And this is an organic soil actually up in Gloucester, and you can see the soil particles sticking to the roots as root exudates and biology linking together. So fertility, basically being the natural output of soil, is the culmination of these above processes, which leads to the production of humus. And the higher the biological activity, the more diverse, more stable, and more resilient this environment and system becomes. So this was talked about by a chap called Anfred Pfeiffer, 1945, 1947, a big biodynamic farmer at the time. And he went on to say, if we looked from a chemical perspective, for instance, he says we've become accustomed to regard soil as the real equation of nutritive values. Such an equation would, as a matter of fact, be correct if we included all the factors, but the following is an example of one-sidedness and an improper equation. This is what he talked about from the nitrogen, the onslaught of nitrogen coming in. Basically, soil plus additional fertilizers equals soil plus yield. And he made this statement in 1940. He goes on to say the proper equation from the point of view of life should be natural fertility plus production capacity equals the sum of biological functioning of. Well, that's just quite a sentence, that. But basically, we have components of fertility, and each component leads to the whole. And he says the consideration or neglect of any one of these factors is just as important as a whole fertilizer equation. Someone suggested, well, you know what? These are all the highlights, and these were incredibly knowledgeable people about agriculture and biology at the time. And someone said the other day, well, why did they lose all this? You know, in a sense, we had this flood of nitrogen coming on. We had to have food production after the Second World War. It was sort of a no-brainer, really. You couldn't compete with just putting nitrogen on and getting food. Friend Sykes, for instance, he's in 1947, wrote about the modern day, what's the compost thing? The Johnson Sue. You'd think the Johnson Sue is something very new, being able to create small amounts of compost dynamically. But he talks about creating a 6 by 6 foot compost heap, rodding down with iron rods to create aeration, filling it with comfrey and nettle extract, and putting dry soil in. And within 6 to 8 weeks, you had this fantastic compost to be able to work with. Well, sort of we forget really that the knowledge of composting was an ancient art, even when the Romans had it. You know, so, and it was really one of the only things that we had at the time that would actually build fertility. So it was very important in farming during that time. We've got Pfeiffer. He sort of talked at the same time about the importance of silica, increasing cell strength, reducing susceptibility to disease, the importance of nitrogen utilization and phosphorus utilization within the plant. Newman Turner, 1955, after 10 years of work on herbal lays, talked about the importance of the herbal lay being the standard of the fertility builder within soil. And of course, we've got down here Lady Eve Balfour. I mean, she set up, I think the Soil Association was set up in response really to the amount of nitrogen flooding the market, to try and really bring some understanding of what proper farming was still about. She set up the Hawley experiment, which was a 36-year experiment with her neighbour, trying to compare more organic techniques with the intensive techniques which were coming onto the system. She believed that mankind's future and human health were dependent on how the soil was treated, and ran the experiment to generate scientific data that would support these beliefs. But at the time, she was dismissed as a crank in the late 1930s for her progressive views on farming. It's sort of really intriguing, really. And also, there was a Russian scientist who was excelled at understanding nitrogen within soils and microbes. He was talking about applying azotobacter, non-symbiotic nitrogen fixers, with rhizobium and clovers to capture more nitrogen. You know, you think, well, actually, there was an awful lot of stuff and interesting experiments going on. And of course, when nitrogen first came, you could suddenly put nitrogen onto any fields, anywhere, and get a crop. When I talked to one of my colleagues, Mike Robinson, when he started Midwinters, a chap called Freddie Cox said he knew people that put so much nitrogen on it killed the crop, because they thought a little was good, so more is better. Interesting concept. So this is Newman Turner's book. It's Herbal Lays as the Basis of Soil Fertility and Animal Health. And this was a trial which is set up really over 3 years. And what we have here with grassland, we have a straight Abereve grass. We have a mix of Italian ryegrass. And here we have a mix of Italian ryegrass with white clovers and legumes. And here we have the same mix, but we have red clover. And I think all you have to really see is that each one of these colours is a different year, but you'll notice that these two here have had no nitrogen at all, and these two here have had 250 kilos of nitrogen per annum, and yet these two have out-yielded every one of the 3 years we've done a trial. You could almost suggest really that any grass with clovers in, you really don't need nitrogen in the system. But this is really reaffirming exactly what Newman Turner was talking about. And I had to put this in really because on the 25th November last year in the Biology magazine, here we go, less intensively managed grasslands have higher plant diversity and better soil health research shows for the first time. We have no knowledge of what went on 80 years ago and the incredible people that were doing all this work. And I feel actually it's really rather sad in a sense that we have this continuous wheel. We do things, we forget it, we start, we relearn, and we do it. And it's rather sad, really. And of course, with the fertility pastures, the work been done by a lot of Cotswold seeds, really. You know, we know that the diversity in these grasses with the legumes and herbs, we're getting copper, iodine, selenium, zinc, cobalt, manganese, sodium, all of these elements that we're having huge problems with animal health in terms of straight grasses. And it's making a huge difference, and we can easily measure it. The dilemma with all of these herbal lays really is how we get connection and collection, and having different species that are able to deep root and collect and work with soils in different ways to capture different nutrients, and we have these different accumulators. And we have huge problems every time we measure grassland on its own. Cobalt, iodine, selenium are the three big things that keep coming up. We don't necessarily worry about them for animal for yield, but for animal health, of course, they're absolutely incredibly important. However, if we look at a system that isn't functioning, for instance, so we have low available phosphorus, low potassium, low magnesium, we start to create weaknesses, we start to build weevil problems, poor rhizobium, no nitrogen, poor root exudates. And more importantly, down the bottom here, low iron, manganese, cobalt, molybdenum means we can't fix nitrogen. And what Nick was talking about this morning really was that you create a plant, if you're not careful, which is a scavenger just as much as grasses. So you can have clover sitting there looking all very pretty, but actually not performing at all. So, we do have to look at these things quite carefully in terms of nutrition and the balance of everything and how they connect together. And a lot of the original organic farms some 20, 30 years ago, the premise really was that it was self-sustaining. And what we find is that clover has a higher nutrient plane than grasses, so if you're short of nutrients, the clover is the first to suffer. And that's the dilemma. And I just put this in just to show you that it doesn't take a lot to get an absolute huge response in certain circumstances. So we didn't do this trial, it was actually a farm trial. And these are quite wet soils, heavy wet soils, fertile soils actually, lots of manures on them, over towards Wallingford. And the problem being is that you've got very quick growing grasses with nitrogen in them, but in the spring, and it's cold and damp and wet, we're not getting phosphorus, we're not getting zinc because the soil biology hasn't woken up. And sometimes even though you've got a lot of nutrient in the soil, the availability can be very restricted. And just by applying some phosphorus and some zinc in there, we've actually more than doubled the yield first cut silage, and we've doubled the bricks readings. So, the fact is once the soils had warmed up, you find actually all of a sudden biology gets going and you can collect the things you need. So it's trying to understand in all of these systems really what isn't just there, it's what's available and how the plant's going to be able to utilise it. But grass is incredibly responsive to nutrient inputs. The problem is it's green, and quite often people think anything's green's fine. It's not like a cereal, for instance, when you see a deficiency. It's very visual. In grass, sometimes it takes quite a lot to go wrong. And this is really just to give you an insight as to probably some of the best soils we work with and some of the poorer. I have to stop saying poor soils really, because they're not poor soils. They're just soils in a different successional state. Haven't got the ability, if you like, to be able to grow crops that we want. And really these two to show you the biology within a soil and how important it is. It's a little bit unfair because this one here is it's a clay loam, so you get the benefits of loam, natural flocculation. It's high in calcium, which means that naturally flocculates as well. So you have better conditions for biology and air within the system to work. And because the soils are more open, you have a lower bulk density, and so rooting is much easier, and you can see a lot of fine feeder roots here. It's a little bit unfair, this one, because this is a clay, so it's tight, and it's got lots of magnesium in it, which draws soils tighter together, which means it's much harder for biology, the conditions for biology, to be able to function, because it's tight, anaerobic, it gets waterlogged quickly. Plants have a difficult job rooting, and so we have poor root exudates. It's more likely we get pathogens from here. If I bring in a farm that's been direct drilling for 10 years, have I put that in the right box? Should it be over here? So what I'm saying really is that biologically this is a poor system, and it isn't right to say that all you have to do is to buy a direct drill and go direct drilling, maybe grow a cover crop once every 3 or 4 years, and your system recovers. It's much more than that. I have come across one particular farm that they've gone to direct drilling and the soil's improved immediately, but every single other occasion we've stepped backwards to begin with rather than moving forwards. And the dilemma, I want to talk about this a little bit further going forward, because I've got some examples of how it's farmed and what it's done, just as ideas really, to show you that it isn't just about the direct drill, it's about how we look at the farm as a complete system. And Ben showed you this a little bit earlier. This was a farm that was starting direct drilling, actually, and this was his, and the soils were waterlogged just before he drilled. And so, the energy and aeration in the soil was particularly poor. And you can see even after 3 months we have no connection really at all, and that's Tim Parton's. And in his situation, after 10 or 12 years of building soils, and you can see it has a huge impact on how plants grow and connect with the soil. So if we threw these two pictures apart and said, well, this is where we want to be and this is where we don't want to be, the question really is on your farms, well, where are you in the point of good and bad? And in other words, where is your starting point? And is your system currently moving backwards or is it moving forwards? So this is the dilemma of, can we define where we are? And if you can, what are we going to do to create a system which improves? So for me, if we could develop a soil like this, and you woke up one morning, that would be the time to buy a direct drill. That would be the time to go direct drilling. That would be the time perhaps to reduce your nitrogen inputs, because you have a system which functions and can give some sort of balance, if you like, to growing a crop. Whereas actually most people tend to look down here as a starting point of change, simply because really that their system isn't functioning, they isn't working, so they want to try something else. We can do a direct drill down here, but we need really a low disturbance lifter. We probably need something like a Vardostat carrier with a cross cutter, so we can actually introduce some air. Any nutrient or manures that we put into this system need to be kept into the surface. We want to build an environment for biology, aerobic biology, to be able to function, because it's aerobic biology which makes the crumb structure and aggregate structure. It's only that life that does it, and without it, your soils go tighter and tighter. Where up here, you could plough it, you could drill it on the wrong day, you could roll it when it's wet, and you would find it has the impetus and energy to be able to repair itself. So, you can actually damage these soils and work forward. You can damage these soils, you go back to square one again. And I try just to give people a bit of an idea of a poorer situation, if you like, and it's soil food web. It's very unstable, unpredictable and weak. And I call it a single point chain reaction, because you have nothing going on here apart from small areas of food source. Maybe at the end of the season, you might have a little bit of rain which draws air in. You might have a little bit of debris, some roots decaying, things like that. So what happens is you have a very small amount of energy which creates a chain reaction down the line, and then it's gone. This sort of system is incredibly unstable. What we're really looking to do is to have something incredibly diverse. And this is called a multiple point chain reaction, which is just chaos theory. You can't figure what's happening or where it's happening, but it has its own energy source which works and releases for the season. It doesn't rely on you putting something in because it has the dynamics to work. And because it's so dynamic, you have the resilience, diversity and stability within that system. So that system carries on. And another, really just an example, if we just go down the middle here and we look at the right-hand side of a plant, we've got tight soils, anaerobic conditions. We've got all this nitrogen in the air which can't diffuse into the soil. Because the soils are tight, we've got poor root systems. We've got anaerobes which are actually working on debris in the soil, but they're producing alcohols, aldehydes, formaldehyde, which are soil toxins. And in the process of all this going on, they're releasing ammonia to the atmosphere, and if you can quite often pick a wet soil up like this and smell it, you can smell the ammonia coming off from applied nitrogen in the spring. So we're unable to capture any air coming in, nitrogen. We collect CO2 in here as well, which basically puts the soil to sleep. What we're looking really to try and achieve is this nice open soil structure which allows bigger root systems, aerobic conditions, allows air to diffuse in. You've got microbes utilising carbon from the soil roots. They're able to convert atmospheric nitrogen into usable nitrogen. And the CO2 that's released back out as respiration goes back into the air and hopefully is captured by the plants here. So what we have is we have really a nitrogen cycle. We can't expect to reduce inputs on this side, but by building a system here we can dramatically. And those are the two examples of what can and you can't do. So I put the earthworms in simply because there's some fantastic studies on earthworms, really, what they can achieve. By allowing a soil system to develop and having food, earthworms will come. They are the first life, if you like, in difficult soils. 25 earthworms per cube foot is around 1 million worms, or 30 tonnes of earth casts a year per acre. The best I've had, is 41 tonnes at Andrew Lingham's in Kent over an 11-week period. This work's fairly new. Everything that goes through an earthworm nearly takes 100% of fusarium out completely. We reduce the bulk density of soil, we increase cation exchange, we increase structural stability. So if you look at a soil when it rains, good structural stability maintains the crumb structure, and a poor tightens and comes capped. And we have increased nutrient availability because just passing through an earthworm, it releases nutrients. These are a little bit high, but it doesn't really matter what the figure is. It's a contribution to the soil. So you've got an earthworm cycle going on as well. And I was just intrigued with this, actually. This was going back to some work that Lady Eve Balfour did, and this is the movement of earthworms, and all she did was boxes with different mixes in. So she's got sulfate of ammonia, compost, NPK, untreated, chemically activated compost, and she did the boxes together, and she looked at the movement of earthworms from box to box. It's really interesting. These dots are earthworm movements, but you can pick out very easily compost, ripe, FYM, compost from experimental heap, as soon as we go to an inorganic fertiliser, even sulphate of ammonia, NPK, or even put NPK into the compost as an inorganic fertiliser, we're inhibiting the earthworms from functioning and moving. And of course it all comes back really to the salt indexes of some of these products, and we know what salt does when we apply it to slugs or anything. It just dries them out, and it's an effect. So earthworms are inhibited really by any salt-based fertiliser and heavy soil movement. So again, all this work was trying to figure out how do we keep our natural systems developing rather than inhibiting it and bypassing them. And so fertility becomes quite a big part of where we're doing all these components of fertility. Well, what are they? This was quite interesting. It's down at Jeffrey Rabbit's, and he had a 5-year scheme that came out. And the whole field had been drilled into all-seed rape, and the field didn't germinate very well. It had no vigour. It had cabbage stem flea beetle larvae, it had flea beetle. It didn't want to grow. And of course, we had no issues here whatsoever. And when the spring comes, I should have taken the picture early really, because it was at least 400% taller in the autumn. It just shows you that natural fertility, releasing nutrients within its cycle, is you can't replace that with just NPK. How we do it, of course, is with our current tools of intensive agriculture is quite difficult. So I was really intrigued with this when at Ben's Monitor Farm meetings, the AHDB farm bench results from first wheats only, and what they're talking about is a weak association between amount of inorganic and applied and yield. So you can see that we've got huge differences here. I'm intrigued with this 10 tonne a hectare as we run along the top here, because we've got somebody here getting 10 tonne a hectare with less than 50 kilos of nitrogen. So fertility-wise, he has to have had a lot of nitrogen from the soil. And we go all the way up here, and we've got 10 tonne here on nearly 300 kilos of nitrogen. So one assumes that soil would have been perhaps in a bit of a difficult state. We always really say to people, to understand what you get from the soil, we do need a little area somewhere just to see what your soil would give you from your natural fertility. I think that's really important, because then you can start to work out the differences between the nitrogen you apply and the efficiency. So this was actually last week. Frontier have got four winter wheat trials, and they found the average increase from N applications was 5.5 tonnes a hectare on 180 to 200 kilograms of nitrogen. So what we're looking at here is a particular system somewhere in Frontier, which is probably an average farming system. We get maybe 4.5 tonnes of yield without any fertiliser on. So we're talking about 10 tonne. So they come in about there. The other interesting thing I've sort of found about this really was that when we first started with the flex trials, we had a really quite a fertile farm, so we did a trial looking at nitrogen inputs. So the farmer himself got 12.5 tonnes, so he was up here, just over 300 kilograms of nitrogen. The untreated was 10.2 tonnes. So the argument is, did his 300 kilograms of nitrogen give him 2.3 tonnes? If we hadn't, so the economics really is, I suppose he was very pleased getting 12.5 tonnes of wheat. But the fact is, it would have been a lot more cost effective actually probably to have grown 10 or 11 tonnes on literally 100 kilos of nitrogen maybe. The cost and economics of all this becomes important, but unless we measure what your soils can give, it's sometimes very difficult to be able to understand what response you get from nitrogen coming in. I thought that was really interesting, that. So, considerations, what we call a biological farmer really, is that biological farming is about an integrated systems approach. It's not about a product-driven system, but products are important. We always want to question and we want to manage symptoms, but work towards solving causes, because otherwise we never change anything. And poor fertility is not solved by adding more NP and K. In fact, we're actually making things worse. And so I wanted to move on and just show you some examples of some of the issues that we see. This isn't a farm I'm involved in. I just look at it a lot as I pass in mornings and weekends. And it was really just to give an idea of how systems change or they don't change. So this was 2 years ago, and this was a field of spring wheat which was left over winter. It's a big field, it's 300 acres. And if we look at the soil, it's basically a silt loam over chalk, so it's got this ability to be able to flocculate, if you like. But it has a few holes in, but it hasn't really got any crumb structure at all in there. And if we look a bit closer, we can see after the rain it's capped a little bit. We've got earthworm casts here and here and here. So that was direct drilled into spring wheat, just cold, and then we moved into direct drilled into spring beans. As you can see, it wasn't a very good crop. The soils were wet when it was drilled. You can see the disc coming through here. And of course the problem is when it's wet, you're smearing and then it goes too dry and it goes too hard. The dilemma here is that I was told that the yield didn't pay for the combine going over it. So this was afterwards the beans. We can see we've got thistles, there's ragwort, and obviously you've got the black grass here coming through. So we go then into this autumn, so it was direct drilled into winter wheat. Well, that actually looks a lot better. What I found interesting was, you can see we've got a little bit of crumb structure here, hopefully you can see, but this straw is now 15 months old, sitting on the surface. We don't really have any earthworms in here to drag it down, and it's just sitting there. And if we look, this is a row of the wheat, but you can see a V here, and that's where the disc went and just slightly moved the soil. So what we've got here is that the tighter regions here, we've got a little bit of living root here. Then we go into January of this year, and you can see the heavy rains have capped the soil down. And this is really serious. It's almost as bad as grazing sheep, just capping that soil surface, stopping the air getting in. And that's because really the biology is weak, so it hasn't got the ability to keep its crumb structure and aeration going. And then if we move to last weekend, just by poking your finger in here, you see this top. Now we've got quite a nice crumb structure. That was a frost coming. So we've now got a little, it's frosted open and it's expanded, and we've got a little bit more crumb structure there. But if we dig a hole, what you see is this is the extent of the crumb structure, and now we go onto a very tight area. I find it really intriguing. What we would like to do really in this sort of field is I'd like to come and low disturbance lift. We'd like to put some manure or something, or we'd like to go into scheme, maybe put an AB15 in for a couple of years so that you've got deep rooting, you've got carbon being captured, and carbon is the driver. Carbon is really what we've got to work towards, becoming carbon farmers rather than nitrogen farmers. But you can see that the soils are moving slowly backwards and forwards. The dilemma is if we go into a very hot summer, all this benefit will be lost because you'll burn out the carbon in the soil as well. So your net movement forward becomes almost a negative. So if we just move, I don't know what that is. Oh yeah. So sorry. So this is the headland. So this is an area that hasn't been sprayed. So you can see it's a bad blackgrass field. So this has not been drilled or sprayed. So if we then actually go and dig a hole there, look at the crumb structure here. It's incredibly different. If we move, and this is just an example of some of the compaction we get if we don't look at what's going on underneath. This is over in Wales, where we're just using discs to work the top when it's a bit wet, and you're just creating this harder and harder pan. But we're actually doing it with the direct rod as well. So this is right on the corner of the field. This has been down for 6 years into a scheme. It's almost rewilded, really. But if we look at it a little bit more carefully and look at the crumb structure of what's happened, this is just nature doing its thing, growing crops as and when it wants to. We can see here there's about 50 or 60 soldier beetles in this stem. We've got spiders coming in, Actinomycetes, Trichoderma, so we've got fungi building to decay the lignin that's been created. This is a death coach beetle, the biggest of the rove beetles that we have wandering around. We've got orb spiders, grove snails, which live off decaying material, marmalade hoverflies. We've got all these other species in the corner here, which are beginning to relocate and move out into the field. And we could see next door up at Julian Gold's, he's doing a University of Reading study at the moment, and you can see trapping insects on the headland compared to the middle of the field, just to the dynamics, the difference in the dynamics of it. And for those people who are working hard to bring nature back into the farm, we talk about earning the right to drop insecticides, but it's not difficult to reduce when you see things like this. So this is spiders in the autumn. Some of the beetle catches we're doing now in a beetle trap, we're getting up to 15 to 20. Have incredible appetite, roaming over nights to capture aphids and any predators that they can find. The spiders, much the same. You can begin to realise if an aphid's going to fly into here, it's got to go through a set of barriers. And that's one of the reasons now I think we're beginning to see farms after 10 or 12 years that don't need insecticides at all. They've got a system which is self-managing and self-controlling. The dilemma that we've had, I suppose, really, is that when we first started having problems on rape, for instance, for flea beetle, we would come in and spray it with an insecticide. Well, that will kill the pest and the predator. But we had an environment which was so big that we'd fill the void. And as time's gone on, we've sprayed more and more and more, so we're spraying all crops now. And what's happened is that we don't have a void anymore to be able to fill a gap that we create. And so what's really happening is that the insecticides now are beginning to promote pests, because we're still killing the beneficials, but we're not killing the pests. So we're beginning to promote pests. And the dilemma we have on many farms now is how do we bring nature back into the centre to move out again? And we believe it's really important to have this as part of a bigger systems approach. All these things are going to help you reduce the cost of farming. And the questions really is how do we connect and collect atmospheric carbon for soil to function correctly, build diverse microbial communities? How do we manage and regenerate soils to allow systems to integrate with nature? Carbon is the food source for microbes to cycle, which builds natural fertility, and it's all about carbon. It's not about nitrogen. And we have to really try and create a system that allows soil life to become the soil managers rather than us. Really, really important. And going on to how we do that, well, Ben showed you a couple of slides this morning on cover crops. If we can get a big cover crop, George, we know that we can achieve a lot. We've got a lot of potassium, 260 kilos of potassium here, 350 kilos of nitrogen. Well, we're not going to use all that nitrogen. And there are dilemmas with cover crops, because if you don't have a system to be able to digest and recycle, these can sit around for 8 or 9 months whilst the situation solves itself. But on the whole, it shows you that we can collect a lot of nutrition from soil in a very short period, given the opportunity. I don't know your yields the following year, George. You've just actually, there's a picture here of, sorry. This is the root systems, and it shows you the dynamic. Once you get this huge growth period, you're getting a lot of maximum root and a lot of exudate, which is connecting with soils, and you can see a big link there. So the George's pictures really, but what did you put on in the end, George?
We put on the following week. We put on, I think it was just over 100 kilos of nitrogen, and it yielded just under a shade under 9.5 tons.
There was no fungicides on here. No fungicides. No. So the dilemma for us really is we want to capture carbon and nitrogen in the system. It's these cycles, but we've got to also be able to cycle them back into the following crop. It doesn't have to be expensive. This is Andrew Lingham in Kent, and he bought that Amazon for 4,500, 6 metre. He built that liquid applicator on the back for 1,500. And so he's putting his liquid applications, that's going into beans. It's not a big crop, but the fact is that he grows cover crops every single field he can on every single opportunity. And you can begin to see that the soils are responding in a really good way. A lot of people think it's very difficult, to be able to drill into these sorts of covers. But the fact is actually it's not as bad as you think, providing you've got wholly a disc drill. It makes a lot of difference. In Andrew's case, it's a bit of a problem with the Amazon Primera when you've got a lot of lignin in the stem, especially mustard. So the disc is a better one really if we can help it. I've done that one. So that was his cover crops down there. So we've even got even more potassium in his. And I've come to the conclusion upon the downs here where we have indices of 3s. If you were a soil or riser, they would come and say you don't need to apply any more potassium. But on these high pH soils, these 8.5s, is that we're always chronically deficient when we get to flagleaf. And it's because the calcium is hiding everything. Dr. Richard Mulvaney's done a lot of work in the States. He's found that actually in many cases by applying muriate of potash you can inhibit the availability of potassium. So we're actually doing the very opposite of what we want, and although we've got it in the soil we can't connect to it. This is a way that we're connecting to it and we're drawing it up. Tim Parton's gone from a 1 up to a 5 on his potassium levels simply by growing cover crops. In fact, now he's having to sell straw off because it's getting a wee bit on the high side. But it just shows you that actually there are different ways of doing it. It's very similar to phosphorus as well. We have in Jersey Royal potatoes, indices of 7 for phosphorus with chronic phosphorus deficiency. It's not about generally what you have, it's how you get it. And that's, again, it's about biology and how that works and how it funds. This particular case with potassium, though, it's drawing it up from depths that our normal crops wouldn't achieve. And again, there's the root structure, look, and it just shows you the connection that we have. So I suppose the argument really is, well, how big can your roots get? So these are a museum for prairie soils, prairie plants, and just shows you that these are obviously perennials which are long term, but you can see exactly how much connection they have there. When they first took these out, these soils had 18% organic matter in, and these were mostly taken out or 90% were taken out in the 1915, somewhere in that area, and it took 8 years before they got a response with applying fertiliser, because that 18% would release about 380 kilograms of nitrogen. So we'd have to wait for that organic matter and nitrogen release to drop. and for nitrogen to be higher than the soil was releasing. In nature, carbon drives everything, all systems. We know that not being able to grow cover crops or leaving your soils what I call non-functioning, we just lose nitrogen. And these are average figures, Frontier, 2 years in different parts of the country. I've just put this in here really. I mean, it's not even worth showing, I don't think. Okay. It's not even worth showing, it's just, but you can see this is Angus Gowthorpe's neighbours' farming system. So we've got diffuse pollution coming down the river, and this is Angus Gowthorpe's ditch coming out here, completely clear. And not only him, but I think Tim Parton was saying the other day they both had their water authorities check the water. They're the cleanest they've ever managed. So the soil is a filter. As well as it cycles, it retains, it breaks down given the right microbes. And it just shows you can take these levels down to next to zero with cover crops. That's a lot of money if you think, really, that you're losing. The dilemma we have, though, is that if you have a poor cover crop, you can still perhaps retain some of that nitrogen and you can still have some benefits, but the fact is that we're not getting the huge benefits that I showed a little bit earlier. And that's our dilemma, really, is that how do we get cover crops in early enough to be able to get the big growth that we require? And this last year, a lot of people haven't been able to do any cover crops. It's a difficult one. These yellow leaves are nitrogen deficient, and obviously the black grass in here becomes part of the scenario. And that is a real dilemma for us, is how do we build a system that has to be carbon based, and for most people it has to be cover crop based because they don't have manures, they don't have any other ability or grass in the system. But growing one cover crop, poor cover crop, one every 3 or 4 years isn't enough to change a system, and that's unfortunately a fact. We need this to be a radical change rather than it being a supporting act to an intensive system. We know everyone says in the end diversity is everything, but I argue in the beginning you don't have diversity. So what you've got to find really is a way of achieving something so your soils can literally be covered, you've got roots and something's working. Once you've achieved that, then diversity is actually really important. The earlier you drill, diversity is important because you're moving into what we call a growth period. So if you're drilling in July, you're at maximum sunlight and heat to create growth. When you get to August, late August, September, you're looking at a development period rather than a growth period. And that's the dilemma. So the earlier you go, the more diversity you can put in. The later you go, the worse it gets. So as you go up north, what do? You've got perhaps black oats, mustard, maybe Phacelia. But that's probably where we think more about grasses. Taking a year off, cash crops, looking at the covers in a very different way. So this is one of Ben Arthur's farms down in Bath. They don't like schemes, I think, do they? They don't like Ben, no. So they've put an AB15 in a really poor field, and they've just basically cut and grazed it for 2 years, and this is the end of 2 years. Have they taken it out, Ben? No, they're not. No. What I see is that when you farm something, it's much more dynamic than when you put it in and just top it from time to time. And this being a poor field, again, we've got this depth of growth, we've got this good connection, and because it's actually aggressive, it's actually created an awful lot of fodder, but actually improved the soils as well. So if we could compare it to someone just trialling an AB15 for 2 years, this is the end of 2 years, and you can see, well, we've got the odd clover, we've got an awful lot of debris that's been topped sitting on the surface. And the dilemma really is that we don't have the fungal bacterial ratios to be able to digest it. So most of our arable soils are 0.4 to 1, and we really want 1.5, 1.6 to 1, if we can really, 1 to 1 is where we need to aim for. And this is where we see sometimes the fact that when you put a wheat crop in after this is that it's hungry, because all the microbes suck all the nitrogen out of the soil, trying to digest lignin that it can't. So we've got to think a little bit more carefully about what your balance of fungi to bacteria ratios are in the soil, and how can we manage these crops coming back into cropping again. Now that first picture I showed you about the farm that's been direct drilling 10 years, this is his farm, and actually this is a movement in a better place. We've got a little bit more crumb structure here. We've got more roots. That's been building roots for 2 years. The dilemma here, this is 20 acres on 2,000 acres. So once we've changed the system and developed something beneficial, how are we going to maintain it? Because if it's just a small area, by the time we get round again, we've gone back to square one. So it's a real dilemma. This has gone into beans because they were worried about the fact that we wouldn't be able to digest any of that, and it would be deficient in nitrogen. We could put some nitrogen on here. We could put digestate maybe before it comes out. Could put a bit of nitrogen with our glyphosate maybe. There are things we could put a fungal digester maybe. There are things we could do perhaps to help digestion. But it's something we need to look at on different farms. So this was a farm down in Marlborough, and it's a heavy field. Sadly, I took the picture after they tried to cultivate it, but this is really just a big, nice block, black grass, full of black grass. So the field next door to this has had AB15 for 2 years. So if you can just keep that in your mind's eye. So this is at the end of 2 years, and you can see this isn't the perfect soil by any means, but look, we've now got some aggregate structure. I can actually break it up in my hands, and we've got root systems moving forward. And actual fact, and there's a red clover root just going down deep. But you can see what the plants have been able to do in 2 years on what is a really, really awful, difficult soil. And we couldn't do that with a lifter. Maybe we should lift before we drill, but the trouble is it gets so dry and hard is that sometimes you just bring up lumps, and it's a real problem. So our dilemma with this field was that this wheat was hungry for the whole season. And so again, we've got this poor fungal biomass in the system. We've got to try and manage. So what we're going to do on this one is we're going to put all the muck they have from their beef on these fields. So we're going to try and balance the fact that we haven't got a system functioning yet in here. So you can see here, this is fungal dominant. I don't see this. This is someone up in North Yorkshire that sent me these pictures, and it's just by the fact we've got these toadstools and mushrooms in the stubble. You can tell this is a herbal ley in here, so you can smell, you can see. But for the majority of us on arable soils, we have to look towards perhaps measuring, and there's quite a few of these labs about now. Laverstoke, this is Soil Biolab down at Andover, and we can measure bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, mycorrhizal colonisation, and we can begin to get a bit of a clue as to how things are going to digest and function, and just by doing that. And there's something called a soil biometer. It's about £300 for 10 samples, and you can do a little test on your farm, and it will give you the ratio between fungi and bacteria. And something very simple and quick, that it's not over accurate. There's a lot of criticism about it. Well, I'm not really fussed about that. It's trend. It's either good or it's bad. The proportions of good or bad. It's good or bad. So from that point of view. So this is quite important. It's not just about having the fungi in the system. It's about also having the protozoa to be able to graze on the bacteria and fungi, to be able to spit out nitrogen, as is the nematodes. So I think we noticed on one of Rob's, the 2 samples that you had on your cover crop, we did a soil as well, didn't we? So one of them came back releasing possibly 168, 180 kilograms of nitrogen, quite nicely balanced. The other one didn't have any fungi or protozoa, talking about less than 6 kilos of nitrogen. So it just shows you, even on a farm, you know, we can have very different perspectives. And this is really just to support that, really, is that we, you know, soils which are very early successional or just beginning out, which are rock, are bacterial dominated. And as they gradually begin to collect soil and things like mosses and lichens, things like that, they will gradually collect dust from the atmosphere. They produce acids, and then gradually as time goes on, they will become a little bit fungal dominant and move up. And this is where we're looking to be 1-to-1. So this is where Tim Parton is. This is where the majority of people are. So this is black grasses and bromes fit quite nicely here. And if we can push things up here, I think that's one of the reasons that Tim and Nick have been noticing that actually brome seems to just want to die out. It gets disease, it gets mildew and rust, it gets weak. It doesn't enjoy the system that it's growing in. Now, I have a bit of a dilemma really with blackgrass, because I do understand that, you know, blackgrass likes tight anaerobic soils, high in ethylene and carbon dioxide. It's an incredibly aggressive rooter. And the argument is, change your soil structure, calcium, open the soils up, blackgrass will go away. And I think that is true. But if you've developed a system which is promoting blackgrass on an annual basis, and you've got 3,000 plants per square metre, and each tiller produces 200 seeds, and a plant can produce 150 tillers, what you're beginning to do is to create the energy towards the blackgrass. And then the blackgrass, if it's thick enough, can start to change the soil in its favour. So I think in the beginning it can be managed, but in the end it's almost become too dominant. The gang is too big just to ask them to move politely. So, but it's interesting, and of course down here we are nitrate dominated, and as we move up into fungal dominated, we're moving towards ammonium. And the balance of nitrogen in soils and the crops we're growing, again, we want this 1-to-1. We're really looking for 75% ammonium, 25% nitrate, and we're nearly always the opposite when we're growing arable crops. And of course, this is 1 year of a herbage seed lay. When you get this sort of debris, you know, it's a lot to ask to direct drill something into that. It's a huge amount of organic material to get rid of, and we simply can overload a system really, really easily. And we've done it with millet, maize for grain. The grain basically, could be 40, 50 tonnes of above ground organic matter in from maize just taken off for grain. So it's a fantastic way of building organic matter in the soil, but you can overload your system. The system can't cope with all that debris, and it's how we manage building a system which is more fungal. So going back to an example again, this was the guy that's been drilling for 10 years. We changed his drill to a horizon, and you can see the soils are tight because we've got these discs open rows. This is the spring barley after it's been drilled, and you can see the tight soils is affecting rooting and also tiller growth. You can see they're very stark. And what we tend to see on these sort of soil types is that it all comes up very well, but as soon as it gets to tillering, it drops all its tillers off. And so you have a very thin crop going towards harvest. Another example, we don't really have any porosity or crumb structure in here at all. And for me, this is the lack of energy, lack of carbon in the system. Because we haven't got enough life, we haven't got enough food to feed life for it to be able to restructure soils. And then we see these sorts of deficiencies coming up because we have no connection with the soil. So just a little video really. All this looks tight and compacted, but it isn't. Again, it's a clay loam over chalk. You know, so in actual fact, it's not a real clay, but you've got a nice earthworm there. But I would have expected a system to be slightly better than that. And if you can see, you can actually crumble it up in your hands. It's not a tight, heavy soil, but it's restricting rooting. And if I had the opportunity, I'd aerate it, and I'd bring some sort of manure in, I think, if I could. But it doesn't suit the system. When you've got one person on 200 acres that wants a simple system, it's not practicable. And if the system works, how can you moan about something that's working, but it's not regenerative, in my opinion? And if we go a little bit further forward, you then start to things going in the opposite way. So we're beginning to see this hogweed coming on the farm. So these are the beans. So we've got, here we go, this is a very early successional weed, this ragwort. So we've got thistles all over the place, parsley, and that basically is just seeding across the whole farm. All the wheats have Broadway star because there's brome everywhere. And this is the recovery of the brome some 6 weeks after the Broadway star is being applied. So it's still seeding. So we're not solving our problems with, we just developed another set of issues to manage. And I just put this in again just to show you, but this is, for me, this is a step forward. But we've still got to cycle all this. And if you've got a soil with nothing in it that can't function, you're growing carbon which can't cycle. So the easiest way, pig manure, digestate, you know, because you provide the nitrogen necessary to be able to provide the impetus, things like that. So lots of things that we can do. And I like putting this one in just purely to show farmers really that I think we really are in a bit of a pickle. So this is, sorry, gone too far. This is resistant ryegrass in a rape field. This is rat's tail fescue in a rape field. And resistant ryegrass really, really worries me. It's resistant to nearly everything, and I think actually we're getting resistance to glyphosate. So it's becoming, what are we going to do? How are we going to farm that in the next 10 years? You know, we can't put AB15 in there because the resistant ryegrass will become a resistant ryegrass sward. If we could take that down to the southwest, we could probably graze it and put it in a rotation, manage it that way. If we go to Kent, there's no livestock at all, and this is endemic over there. You know, so we can take 2,500 acre farm, every single field has resistant ryegrass on it, and the combine is now a super spreader. And we're talking about having sacrifice areas to bring the combine in, which we would leave to glyphosate simply because as soon as the combine starts, it dumps all its grass seeds on the soil. We haven't got a rotation that we can manage it in. And when we had curb and crawler, we could do beans and oilseed rape twice. We could do got you through. But when you think it only takes one rain any time during the year to get this to germinate, and then in 6 weeks it's seeding, it is far worse than blackgrass. And it's a real dilemma. And because people are making money and they're suppressing it with chemicals still, I don't think people are worried too much about it. But if I had a farm like this, I'd be worried to death. Because once it gets like that, how are you going to farm? You know, unless you want to bring livestock in. So I would say this has been caused by our farming system and chemicals, not managed by our farming system and chemicals. We've got to a state where it's become so dominant that it's broken the system. And so the question really is, well, where does one go with all this? And there's a lot of difficulties about sitting down and talking about fundamentally changing how a farm is farmed. away from maybe wheat rape to something dynamically different, and maybe the schemes have to come into all this, but we can't carry on, I don't think, ignoring these issues. And I put this in really just because it's sort of quite exciting. I find our problems with growing cover crops, companion crops, relay crops. Wild Farm has been set up by Andy Cato up at Swindon, and he's looking for contracts to grow polycrops. So this one here is beans and wheat together. They're growing barley and peas together, buying them as a crop together. You can't put any chemicals on them. And then obviously trying to put understories of clover or grasses and inter-row mowing so that you manage one crop to allow the other one to become dominant. And I sort of quite like the idea of this system because we can start overlaying crops onto crops. We can perhaps put our cover crop in April, May into our wheat crop so that when the wheat comes off, you've got something big potentially to come. It's already established. We know that if you drilled 10 days earlier on average in the autumn, you double your biomass of your cover crop. So we know by putting something in earlier, if we could get these really big cover crops, could we achieve change quicker? But or should we struggle with poor cover crops and carry on with chemicals for 10 years and not solve our problems? I know it's a difficult one. The difficulty I have now with Wild Farmed is that they allowed you to use chemicals before your crop went in. Now they've got a 3-year contract. After the first year, you have to drop all chemicals. So I can cope without the glyphosate. I can cope with the glyphosate, but not. I don't know whether. Because many farms have still got problems to solve. If you've got black grass or wild oats in your system, you can't just drop all that and go into something like this. And the fact is that they want it to be on the same field. So how are you going to create a rotation and manage that? And if you've got no chemicals for 3 years, you're going to have to think about different cultivation, different weed control, completely different system on a farm which maybe is going to be separate to the block system. There are a lot of questions really, I think. But we have a mower coming, and we're going to do some work. The principles I quite like is that if you strip drilled your rape, you could strip drill white clover between. Rape comes off, glyphosate, strip drill wheat in between the clover. You've got established clover capturing nitrogen. You could take the clover out with some styrene if you wanted, or mow it just to keep it under control. And then you could come and potentially, if you wanted, drill your next cover crop into it. So I could see for small farmers this would be an interesting way of becoming more intensive, but capturing nitrogen, building bigger carbon, and being slightly more intensive within a complete system. There's a lot to do, a lot of questions, and this was the wheat that was drilled on 14th of September. This is a heritage wheat, and they've got the cover crops, the companion crops underneath. This has been grazed on the 20th of November, and they were just managing between. The dilemma I have is when you've got weeds, for instance, is if you graze your crop, you're allowing the weeds to become potentially more dominant because the sheep generally eat the crop rather than the weeds. And talking of grazing, I put this in because we are having really a lot of problems with grazing and damaging. So we know that overgrazing of crops can lead to negative effects just purely from capping, soil capping. It just stops air getting in. It restricts rooting, and then means you're dropping tillers. So I've seen locally 0.8 a ton per hectare drop on spring barley. But actually grazing an autumn crop and overgrazing it has significant issues in terms of upsetting the plant from functioning. So I was always told really that if you graze more than 70%, you stop your rooting for a month. There's a big difference, isn't there? Up to 50% is 5%, 60% is 50%. So this is stuff from Gabe Brown when he came over earlier on in the year. But you can easily take your system backwards. So all I would say to anyone grazing is just be careful, because you can take a fair bit of yield out. But it is part of the system. So I see this potentially working perhaps larger farms. I've got an example here. So this was barley that was drilled first week of September, just on manure, and this was grazed 3 times. Literally just 20% off, just nipped the top off. And you can see how it's just taken these tops off. It's actually promoted growth and tillering. So we had 3 quick autumn grazings. We did put a fungicide on, 80 kilos of nitrogen, 8.7 tonnes a hectare, add up to a very profitable crop, and that was a crop just prior to harvest. So what it does when you've got early growth to take out, it takes aphids out, it takes disease out, it manages forward growth, and it puts you back to where perhaps you would be with a later drilling. The dilemma is when you put sheep in there and it grazes down, you can't actually see the rows. You suddenly realise what you've done is you've taken the whole system backwards. But it is a part of where we need to go, but I think it has to be managed very carefully. The chameleon system, I think you probably know about this, but it's John Paul's drill system, which is a Swedish hoe and drill. So he would drill, and next he would hoe in the middle, and then he would drill in the middle with his relay crop. The dilemma with the hoe systems, if you've got stones, brings them all up, and if you've got hard soils, tight soils, you need soils that can function and work. And so for many farms it doesn't fit. But it is another option if one's trying to reduce inputs. So in the end, it's all about balance, and that's what we really need to try and understand. We want to build a systems approach to farming first, product support second, if we can. And you can see diversity here. Actually when it works, I think you can just see that it just looks nice. Good root systems. It's how soils should be. Really just to try and finish off, to give you a bit of an example in pictures again. This is a biodynamic calendar. You don't really have to worry. You've got time moving along this slide here. So we've got autumn, equinox, winter, spring, summer, next autumn. So the only thing I wanted to really just show really is that you've got this. The winter is really regarded as the decomposer or building cycle, humification cycle. So this is where fungi and all the debris go in. So it's very high, increasing decomposition, and it's basically capturing and creating nutrition and holding it in a humus. And then as spring comes, it dips down, and what we move towards is the energy release cycle, which is the mineralization. So what the plants are doing is thumping out root exudates. You've got bacteria, mycorrhizal fungi, all sorts of things. They're beginning to utilize what you've captured, recycled and retained from the winter. So just as an example of that, you've got your big diverse crop here. So we've got high nitrogen and carbon capture, we've got great connection and biological growth, we've got nutrients collected, recycled, retained in the system. We have lower bulk density of soil, we have high organic matters. That leads to low soil disturbance, low applied nitrogen, debris and companion crops return to soil, bigger root systems. That is a cycle of systems. So full connection and partnership to nature leading to reduced reliance on inputs. So let's have a look at our other system. So system created in isolation to nature is reliant on purchased inputs. So we've left our soils bare, even though we've got something here. We've got no carbon capture, no nutrient capture, retention or recycling. We have high nitrogen groundwater losses, soil left to the effects of winter rain, higher bulk density of soil and lower organic matter, poor soil biology, leading towards poorer connection, lower nutrient collection, soil movement destroys structure, carbon, and high nitrogen drives off carbon as well. So you have a complete disconnect here. And the reason I put this is a very old picture actually. There's a line down through the middle here, but the far end had red clover for a year and it was topped. and this end had wheat. So this is a second wheat, and this is a first wheat after clover. So the clover at the end had no nitrogen whatsoever following the wheat, and this had 220 kilos of nitrogen. I can't remember the yields, but the back out-yielded the front. So I'm sort of hoping really that the things that we've talked to and the pictures I've shown you today have given you an indication of that this is a holistic system somehow. How you build it and work with it, and the fact that it moves forward and backwards potentially on an annual basis, whether it's nature or whether your intervention, is part of the art of farming. And every one of the farms here will be different. So although we're talking about similar solutions, how we build a system to become more efficient is a very individual approach. But just comparing that with that, to me, I think sort of sums up where we need to go for farming for the future. And I think I'm going to leave that as my story for today. Thank you. Thanks very much.